everyone at MoodComp. Today, I'm very glad to have this excellent panel. Last week was a tough and intense week for MoodComp's 2022 Moody's. You have experienced up and downs, but most importantly, you have learned that you can achieve any outcomes that you want with hard work and practice. Though not all Moody's can participate in the final rounds, certainly you have achieved a very good outcome. And this panel is basically a help for you to expand a bit more your knowledge. At MoodComp, we are very convinced that education and competition are two factors that strongly influence the progress of people and countries. Therefore, for 6 years, MoodComp has joined efforts of the world's top leaders to provide future lawyers and economists in Latin America with a unique experience and job opportunities seeking education and excellence. Today is not the exception. I am more than pleased to have such a prominent group of panelists to discuss the intersection between antitrust and ESG. First of all, I would like to welcome Martin Snop, head of the Authority of Consumer and Markets from Netherlands, who is a pioneer on ESG and antitrust discussions, as well as Paola Pugliese, partner at the Mares Advogados from Brazil, who will give us our perspective from Latin America, and Jonathan Ford, from a partner from Linklaters in the UK, who will provide us a perspective from the European practice. Finally, but not least, I want to thank Fiorella Saumeta, partner at Miranda Llamado from Peru, to participate as moderator. So without further introduction, I thank very much these panelists and give Fiorella the voice to continue.
Hi, Carlos. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. It is truly an honor to moderate this panel and to be able to share ideas, experiences, thoughts with experts in the field such as Martin, Paola, Jonathan, who I'm sure will bring different perspectives and very interesting ones to the table. Today, we will be addressing the intersection between ESG, environmental, social governance standards, and competition policies. At first glance, it might seem that there is a kind of a dichotomy or contradiction between these two concepts, since on the one hand, antitrust policies seek to promote competition between firms, and on the other hand, the success of ESG policies often requires cooperation among competitors. However, as we will discuss throughout this panel, these are not excluding concepts. On the contrary, it is possible to reach agreements that improve environmental, social, and governance conditions without affecting competition in markets, ensuring the welfare of competitors and achieving positive effects that exceed the restrictions that might derive from such agreements. So let's start by understanding why this intersection is so important. Why do we have to talk about it? Why the Moody's have discussed about it during this competition? So that is going to be a very interesting talk, not only for lawyers or economists, but for authorities, practitioners, entrepreneurs, and everyone in the audience. So, Martin, why don't you give us your perspective from this authority point of view on this intersection?
Thank you very much, Fiorella, and I'm extremely happy to be part of this panel and to be able to address the Moody's and the people who are interested in this project about why competition and sustainability are important topics and why I think this is one of the two important topics in competition law debate around the world. One is obviously the digital enforcement, the enforcement in the digital area. And I think the second is how competition authorities, how competition lawyers and competition economists are dealing with something that I coined once as what is probably the biggest market failure in the history of mankind. Because markets are not perfect. We all know that. We are very used to dealing with market power. But that's not the only market failure that we are addressing. Negative externalities are maybe, just as important. And what do I mean with negative externality? For those of you who do not have an economic background, a negative externality happens when I consume a product and I have a negative effect on someone else. There is not a win-win, but there is a win-lose. When I consume something, someone else will lose. If I consume something that is produced with CO2 emissions that is not being compensated in one way or another, I'm hurting someone else because someone else is facing the cost of the CO2 emission that goes together with my consumption. And that is the biggest problem. And the problem is now so massive that if we continue to produce and consume like we're doing now, we're making in the long run, we're making our planet inhospitable for future generations. And that's why we need to do something. Well, under normal standard economic theory, if there are negative externalities, because this is not the only negative externality, but negative externalities can be best addressed by the government by putting in place laws. And that's why we have many laws that address negative and reduce negative externalities. But the problem here is we are not only facing a market failure, but we're also facing a regulatory failure. Regulations, governments are not able to correctly impose the laws and timely impose the laws necessary to sufficiently address the negative externalities. And why is that? It's not because they're bad or that, but there are just problems, and there are problems in our democratic process that are inherently difficult to address these problems. One of the issue of CO2 emissions and environmental damage in general is that there is a cost now and a benefit later. We have to pay higher prices now for more sustainable production, and the benefits will occur, decades from now. And the clear benefit is not destroying our planet. But the problem is that the people who are now voting and who are elected, probably by the time the greatest benefits will occur, will no longer be alive. And the people who will benefit from these benefits a couple of decades down the road do not have the right to vote now. So there is an underrepresentation in the political process of the people who will benefit most from the increase in prices and the reduction of CO2 now. That makes it not impossible to come to a democratically elected regulation, a democratically based regulation, but it makes it very difficult. The second is there is an asymmetry between the beneficiaries of CO2 reduction and the victims of CO2. We know that the global north, if I can call it like that, disproportionately contributes to the emission of CO2. And we also know that the global south is disproportionately hurt by the emission of CO2. So there you see there is a difference between the ones who benefit the most from the cheaper products and the resulting CO2 emissions, and the ones who are mostly hurt. And then the third problem that we are facing, and that's causing this regulatory failure, is that we all have a loss aversion bias. All people find it difficult to give up something if you not know what you're getting for it in return. And that's the transition phase we're in at the moment. We have to give up our old ways of driving gas fuel cars, of electricity generation, of the way of how we take a plane, and we don't know yet what we'll get back for it in return. And because of this loss aversion bias, it is very hard in the democracies that we're living in to come to really effective regulations that address these devastating negative externalities. Now here, the link with competition. I want to make sure right from the beginning that competition law is not a solution. The solution is that we get over our biases, that we show solidarity in the world, and that we get proper regulation. Regulation is the first best solution, that is for sure. But competition law must not stand in the way of what I would call a second best solution. And the second best solution is that businesses take the initiative and, if necessary, come together and join forces to address these negative externalities. And that's why competition law and competition law enforcement and sustainability are important. And that's where the debate at this time focuses. How do I see this? Because there is a role that businesses need to play. And ideally, in a competitive market, businesses should do this alone so that we have the benefit from the risk appetite, the innovation drive, and the consumer focus of entrepreneurs. So ideally, we want businesses to address these negative externalities themselves. But at the same time, we know that businesses sometimes cannot do this alone. For example, because they have a first mover disadvantage. If they change their production processes and it leads to a higher cost price, and they cannot pass on the cost price because their competitors are not investing in a more sustainable production process, they will simply go out of market. And that is something that they cannot afford. Could also be that there are coordination problems. Let's say that you want to change your production processes, but you need a more sustainable or a different input. Let's say you need hydrogen instead of natural gas for your production processes. In order to do that, you need to coordinate with a supplier of hydrogen. And the supplier of hydrogen, is maybe willing to scale up its production, but only if he has sufficient demand. And then maybe that one company that wants to do an innovative product does not generate enough demand. So therefore, it needs to collaborate with other potential purchasers in order to get the economies of scale so that the producer of hydrogen is getting the right economies of scale to invest in a hydrogen plant. And those are only two of the reasons why sometimes coordination, cooperation among competitors is necessary to reach sustainability goals. We also know this from a fact that I think the law firm Linklaters and Jonathan can say something about it. They did a survey among many businesses, and they indicated that the competition law indeed stands in the way of business initiatives that improve the footprint, the carbon footprint, and the sustainability initiatives of the businesses. And I believe, and with me, fortunately, a lot of other competition enforcers believe that competition law should not stand in the way of these genuine sustainability initiatives by businesses. And that's the reason why we took the initiative now a little less than 2 years ago to draft guidelines, sustainability guidelines. For those who are interested, they can be found on our website. They are published in English, specifically to generate a global debate for those lawyers, economists, policymakers who are interested in the intersection of competition and sustainability. And we did two things in the sustainability guidelines. First, we indicated which types of cooperation among businesses restrict competition and which don't. Because sometimes businesses think that a certain type of cooperation is restricting competition, but in how we look at it, they don't, or it's not, or it is an insignificant restriction of competition. And therefore, we created, by hypothetical examples, we created room and removed some of the perceived threat of competition law. Second, under European law, and this may be different in laws around the world, or I know it is different in laws around the world, but under European law, there is an exemption to the cartel prohibition. Cartels are prohibited, anti-competitive agreements are prohibited, but there is an exemption in Article 101, paragraph 3, which basically says if the benefits of any anti-competitive agreement outweigh the harms of that agreement is exempted. Well, we won't go into detail now, maybe later for the debate on the conditions attached to that exemption, but it's important that to give guidance, that competition authorities give guidance on how this exemption applies to business cooperation. And that's what our guidelines did. So our guidelines indicated first what types of cooperation restrict competition and what types not restrict competition. And second, our guidelines indicated how we interpret this legal exemption to the cartel prohibition. This is on the content side in the guidelines. And then secondly, kind of on the procedural point, we also made two important points in the guidelines, I think. First of all, we told the business community we are open to give informal guidance. So if you're still in doubt and if your legal advisors are not able to give you the assurance, the necessary assurance that your initiative, your cooperation falls outside the competition laws, then please come to us and we are happy to give guidance. So we said the doors are open. And this is new for us because normally we have a self-assessment regime. So that means that normally we do not give guidance to businesses. That's really up and their advisors. But for this specific reason, we thought it would be wise and also prudent to spend public resources, because it costs us capacity, obviously, but to spend public resources to give this guidance. Also, because we believe, the taxpayers in our country benefit if companies come to these genuine sustainability agreements. So this is the first procedural point. And then the second procedural point in our guidelines is that we gave immunity from fines to businesses who did a bona fide attempt to stay within the boundaries set by the guidelines. So even if businesses do not approach us and ask us for informal guidance, but if they just go along and follow the legal advice and follow a bona fide interpretation of our guidelines and come to an agreement that somehow along the way turns out to have an anti-competitive effect that cannot be outweighed by the benefits, we said we are not going to fine them as long as you will adjust the agreement according to the orders that we'll give. And by doing that, so by giving guidance on the content and by putting in place some procedural guarantees and assurances, we hope to generate more initiatives by the businesses. At first, and this I'll come to the final point, by giving you also some practical examples, we thought we would be overwhelmed by business initiatives because many businesses told us, please give us guidance. And, if we get the guidance, you'll get plenty of requests for informal guidance. I must say we were a bit underwhelmed by the amount of requests for informal guidance. And we don't know exactly why that is. It could be that the perceived fear of the antitrust laws was a little bit conveniently exaggerated in the sense that it gave the businesses a proper excuse not to do anything. Could be. I don't know. It could also be that businesses say, well, yeah, it's great that in the Netherlands you give guidance, but most of our agreements are international agreements. So as long as at least the European Commission doesn't come out with its guidelines, then it doesn't make any use to go for a purely local national agreement. There's also a possibility. Other possibility is that it is pretty complicated to come to an agreement. Well, it's pretty complicated to come to a cartel agreement. It's also pretty complicated to come to a genuine sustainability agreement. I was in private practice for 28 years, and I've been involved during the course of my career in a number of bona fide, genuine sustainability types of agreement, and also very much involved in negotiations, it's difficult. The interests between the businesses are not aligned. Some businesses want to go further than other businesses, and you need to come to an agreement with your competitors who you basically distrust. And that's, of course, what the foundation of the competitive process is. So then now somehow come to an agreement is difficult. And we know that. For those of you who are in the cartel practice know that even in bad cartelists on the cartel continuously. Well, of course, they are afraid that their competitors are cheating in a genuine sustainability agreement too. So that could also be. And that's why I'm saying is, right from the beginning, it's not that competition law is the solution to the regulatory failure and the market failure that we're seeing. No, it's not. But we don't want competition law to stand in the way either. That is the most important part. Now, a couple of examples of the things we did, because over the past 2 years. Just to give you a flavor of kind of the practical types of cooperation that we dealt with in our informal guidances. And most of these informal guidances can also be found on our website. So for those of you in English, so for those of you who are interested, you can find it on our English language page of the website. One of the first cases was a monitoring system that was agreed between dairy farmers in the Netherlands and dairy cooperatives to check minimum requirements of animal welfare, animal health, and food safety. And that required an agreement among competing cooperatives and competing dairy farmers. And they came up with a joint monitoring system. Second initiative was a initiative by competing producers on a purchasing market where they decided to jointly purchase wind energy. And by this joint purchasing contract, a significant offshore wind energy project was able to materialize. Third was an agreement among electricity grid operators who agreed on the use of a CO2 calculation tool for joint purchasing problems. Joint purchasing initiatives. Again, the grid operators who are now expanding their grid tremendously because of the electrification of many formerly fossil fuel production processes and consumption now need to invest. They need to build and rebuild their electricity grids. They need to insource capacity from construction companies, but obviously they want to do this in a CO2 efficient manner. And that's why they agreed on a joint tool so that they use the same CO2 emission standard and calculation methods. Another agreement on which we gave informal guidance was the joint development and marketing of a big offshore CO2 storage capacity project. So carbon storage, carbon capture and storage is one of the elements, although controversial, but it is one of the elements that it's at least necessary for the time being to achieve the CO2 goals in Europe. And one of the big projects was initiated by Shell and Total Energies, two big energy companies, and they set up this CO2 facility, and it was necessary in an initial phase to come to a joint kind of development of that project, but also the joint sale of the capacity of that CO2 storage project. You can find it in our guidance on how we did the analysis on the competition, how we did do the competition analysis. Two more things. One was a kind of a smaller, but I think also kind of symbolic informal guidance that we gave on an agreement between soft drink bottlers, among which Coca-Cola, to reduce the plastic packaging of multi-packs. So if you have cans and bottles, multi-pack, a lot of plastic is being used. You have the wrap around the bottles, but at the same time, there are also plastic handles. And the problem here is that the plastic handles of the multi-pack is of a different type of plastic as the wrapping. And because there is the plastic handle, which is in a way convenient for customers, but because everything is put together, recyclability of the plastic wrapping is significantly reduced. So the soft drink bottlers agreed not to put any plastic handles on the packaging anymore, so that the recyclability of the plastic wrapping would be improved. So that was I called it it's a small step, but lots of small steps also help to save the planet. And then finally, the most recent case that we dealt with was an arrangement between garden centers that sourced plants that you have in your home. And there was a problem with plant growers that they were using illegal pesticides. And the garden centers, under pressure from NGOs, came to a collective boycott scheme where they said, well, if one of the plant growers is found to have used these illegal pesticides, they will be put on a blacklist, and no garden center in the Netherlands will source plants from these plant growers unless they've kind of cleaned up their act and showed with certification that they will no longer use these illegal pesticides. And so this is next to regulatory enforcement, because there's obviously also a regulatory enforcement agency, which is significantly understaffed in the Netherlands. So they were not able to root out the use of illegal pesticides. And that's why the garden centers took up this collective boycott scheme to reduce the use of these pesticides. And this is an interesting point, because here for the first time, we introduced the concept of illicit competition. And we said that competition laws are not meant to protect competition below a statutory standard. Competition that is basically based on illegal practices. So, and we feel that this could also apply to other practices. So these collective boycott schemes to root out illegal practices, either in the Netherlands or abroad, are possibly an important example of other practices, particularly in light of the ESG initiatives that many companies are now facing in Europe and abroad. And many companies need to clean up their supply chain and need to look up in their supply chain for particularly adverse effects on human rights and on the environment. And we believe that under the competition laws, they can come to an agreement and a collective boycott regime with proper due process in place to kind of do a sort of not even semi, but private enforcement of reducing below standard illegal practices up in the supply chain. So this is what's driving us as a competition authority. This is what we hope to inspire the Moody's to think about these issues. We hope to inspire other authorities, and we hope to inspire businesses by making together this planet better. And we hope also to show a way that competition law does not have to stand in the way of these types of initiatives. And I'm more than happy to discuss this further with this distinguished panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think that Martin has raised a very important issue, because ESG policies not only seek better quality of life, that is what we all have in mind, but also seek efficiencies, to produce in a way that does not generate more costs than benefits, to make companies internalize the cost of their activities, and that it's important for the competition environment. Also, it is a reality that a change is difficult or very costly to do in an individual basis. So agreements between competitors, it is necessary to reach ESG policies. It is impressive also the level of awareness of the importance of promoting ESG policies in the Netherlands and in Europe in general. I'm sure that the guidelines that Martin has talked about will bring some light for other authorities to navigate in this issue. Unfortunately, I think that in developing countries such as Peru, at least, this debate is not even put on the table. Paola, how do you see this discussion regarding the intersection between ESG and competition policies in Latin America?
Well, first of all, thank you, Fiorella. Let me start by thanking WITCOM for this kind invitation. And I want to greet my fellow panelists here, Martin, who's in the forefront of this discussion globally. And John, it's always very interesting to hear you and the experience that you had at Linklaters in this front. Well, before we go into this, I'll start by maybe explaining why I'm here, which is probably something you might be thinking, why the hell you want to hear from a Brazilian private practitioner on sustainability issues, particularly because we have these two Titan gentlemen in the field here. But I'll explain by saying first that probably because I'm Brazilian, and you might want to hear from a Brazilian why Brazil, a country which could naturally have been a protagonist in this discussion, is so far from playing this role. And second, because as you mentioned, Martin, as private practitioners, we maybe come across some of the business that don't even have reached the competition authorities yet because they died before they went to the regulators. So this might be, what I can share with you a bit here, why I'm sitting here today. And maybe also, and that's an interesting thing to share with you, I act as the vice chair of the Competition Commission of the International Chamber of Commerce. And in that role, I've co-headed with Professor Simon Holmes a task force that researched and investigated the relationship between antitrust and sustainability. And we wrote a white paper that went live yesterday and that will be presented in COP27 next week, that, precisely describes the situations where, businesses have died before they come to the competition authorities. So we took the chance that we have this capability at the ICC to hear from business from more than 30 jurisdictions and see what is not coming across the competition authorities yet. And I think, Martin, one of the reasons why they're not reaching you is it might be the case that there's or they have overestimated the ESG cooperations. But I am more inclined to think that, as you mentioned, cooperation among competitors is already a very difficult thing to negotiate. And then you can picture that, sometimes they will not please their own consumers, right? So it's a difficult decision to make as a business, not to please your consumer. Agree that with your competitor, pay quite a lot of money to your lawyers that will say no go. Right. So this, and obviously, or they could say, well, you can go if it's a Dutch effect, but not if this goes beyond that. So, I mean, and it's light in the end of the tunnel to hear you, but the thing is, we're hearing from the regulator that has shown to be the most sensitive one, let's say, right, to this issue. Speaking in the spectrum, let's say, of competition authority sensitivity to this issue. And And I think if we look at Brazil, we would be looking at the opposite extreme in that spectrum. So what we hear from you that what we just heard, actually, we hear the Brazilian competition authorities say, well, the new Bernaysians are going back to the years before Chicago School, and then the antitrust regulators are expected now to deal with everything. And additionally, and I think this one is interesting, we hear quite a lot of times the general superintendent of CADE, Brazilian Competition Authorities, say, well, we do not have jurisdiction over these issues. This is the business of the Ministry of Environment, or this is the business of IBAMA, which is the environmental regulator in Brazil, not ours. Which, in fact, I personally find this jurisdictional excuse a nice way to divert from, the merits of the discussion, because if you think about it, I mean, every time a regulator says I have no jurisdiction, people will stop talking and look for the right person to interact with, when in fact, I mean, it's a diversion method, because it's not we're not talking about the environment. We're talking about competition just as much. When we are investigating, cartels in the labor market, we're not talking about labor laws. We're talking about competition, right? So, I mean, and that's the same when we have mergers that, have sustainability goals. We're discussing how much competition are we willing to give up, or how much of a reduction in competition are we willing to accept in exchange for a quicker transition into the green economy, right? So it's essentially antitrust, period. Well, the Brazilian government, as you know, has taken some controversial views, let's say, right, in relation to environmental protection in the past years. So it's even less expected if we're discussing more basic is ESG regulation being under attack, that is not expected that the government will, let's say, support that the competition authorities, go with the sustainability agenda. But and I think this has the harmful effect, unfortunately, of spreading out also to the rest of Latin America. Brazil has been for years a jurisdiction that other Latin American agencies have looked up to, on top, obviously, of the Americans and the Europeans. But unlike the United States and Europe, Brazil speaks closer to the Latin American heart, let's say, or the regulators of Latin America, because we're also a developing country. We have our own problems. We have a big forest to protect. And this is not only a Brazilian thing, right? We have quite a lot of people to feed. So, I mean, the Brazilian example has always been important to the other Latin American countries, which makes us, obviously, this deniable position of the Brazilian authorities here worse, and allows the Latin American regulators to shy away from the discussion, at least, to stay away, let's say, from the problem, right? Which is precisely what's happening. I met myself, you might remember this at the ABA spring meeting this year, that we had this discussion with colleagues from Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, and Chile. And I asked them, look, how is the sustainability agenda going with the antitrust authorities? And the answer, as you said, Fiorella, was, well, this agenda is nowhere. And because I could not believe them, a couple of months later, I organized a panel with the Brazilian Competition Authority and the Mexican Authority and Chile and Argentina. And I heard this from them as well. Unfortunately, which made the Brazilian president of CADE look at me and say, see, which is, well, I'm laughing about it, but it's very concerning. Latin Americans don't want to be on the wrong side of history on this issue. That's the truth, and which brings me back to being a private practitioner in this field, right? As lawyers, we frequently see things before they go to the public authorities, as I said. And I was lucky enough to see many companies in Brazil wanted in desire to take things in their own hands and say, look, we're we're doing this, and we're cooperating. And we've received quite a lot of consultations in that respect. I'll tell you about one that was very interesting. The 3 largest Brazilian banks came to us and said, well, we want to discuss we want to force the meatpacking industry to evidence that they are monitoring the supply chain to the point that we see there's no do you say deforestation in English? Yes. So they're not engaged in deforestation of the Amazon. But we want to do this collectively. Otherwise, if one of us does it and says, well, I'm not financing the meatpacking industry, if you don't prove you're not burning down the Amazon, they will move to the next bank. And then, so we discussed and we said, how much cooperation can you do this? And this is one of the deals that died because they did not want to consult with the competition authorities, which would be, ideally the way to get them the comfort that they would not be investigated for that purpose. So this is what motivated the investigation that we did in the ICC, because, if I had faced this myself in Brazil, I thought this might be something that is coming up elsewhere. And we heard from 30 jurisdictions that this is indeed happening. And we collected 12 business cases that we'll present in the paper in a couple of days in the panel at COP27. So we selected 12 cases, 12 business cases. We fictionalized them. So we changed names, we changed the industries, and we will show. We hope that this will be a call to arms to the authorities to say, look, this is what is going on in the real business world, because collectively, also the competition authorities are not, taking the same or going in the same direction. So I invite you, Martin, in particular, to hear the results of this research. It's a very interesting multi-jurisdictional exercise. But I guess this is where we are, Fiorella. So I'll stop here because I want to stop to hear myself and want to hear from John, his experience with the Race to Zero and GFANZ. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Paola. That is very true. I think we definitely have a long way to go, and it is important for authorities to include this topic on the agenda, that it's a reality. It is important to understand that this is more than a sectoral regulation, as you have said. And actually, the labor example that you provide us with, it's very clear. No, it's very pertinent because there are a lot of guidelines on authorities, competition authorities in Latin America, talking about how to craft this kind of agreements, labor agreements, in order to avoid cartels. Why don't we work on guidelines on ESG arena? That would be really, really helpful.
Let me just add here. Sorry, Fiorella, just on that point. If you look at this example, you see that this has extra territorial effects, right?
Exactly.
Burning down the Amazon is in the interest of everybody. And because the Brazilian competition authorities would not invite people to speak with them in that respect, people are, breathing a less, clean air elsewhere. So it is a call to arms, really, that authorities come together and say and enforce and put pressure on the others that are, in the different side of the spectrum, because this has an extraterritorial effect. This affects everybody. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, that is very true. Well, Jonathan, it would be very enlightening if you could share with us the implementation of this kind of commitments and experience in Europe.
Thanks very much, Fiorella, and thanks very much for the rest of the panelists for inviting me along today. I'm a partner in global law firm Linklaters, and I'm based in London and Ireland, but I focus on European and UK competition issues, and particularly with respect to sustainable finance in the last few years. So it's great to be able to come here and give a bit of a practitioner's perspective on top of what Paola had mentioned, and hopefully give a bit of a sense of the viewpoint from clients in this space. And I think it's fair to say that antitrust issues are increasingly front of mind for clients as they're navigating these sustainability efforts. I saw this week at COP that the former Bank of England chairman, Mark Carney, said that the perceived risk of antitrust penalties over collective action is really one of the biggest challenges in the push towards a greener economy, and particularly in greener finance. So I was going to touch on businesses' motivations in this area, the challenges that we see with the current framework, which I think Martin has covered as well, and also why increasingly we need to see this globally consistent approach to avoid what might lead to a risk of racing to the bottom. So thinking about the motivations, the climate objectives and the targets are ambitious. COP was held this week, and it's striking that scientists are already saying that we've fallen too far behind just 1 year after these objectives were set. And the consensus, at least in the science community, is that more needs to be done. So Martin gave a good overview of the challenges in getting the regulatory and political hurdles overcome and why the regulatory program isn't keeping up. And this means that the pressure is being put on business to get ahead and lead the charge. The second best solution that Martin mentioned. I think the challenge from our clients' perspective is that they need to align this with their broader corporate duties to shareholders, but also particularly in the financial sphere with their fiduciary duties to clients. So this can lead to different outcomes depending on what we're looking at. And the number of initiatives actually don't need collaboration, as Martin mentioned, to get ahead. There can be financial benefits in getting ahead if we're looking at new technologies or in industries where consumers value sustainability. And this is obviously the best route if you can facilitate competition to achieve your aims. But we often hear about first mover disadvantages at play in being the one to miss out by going green first, and doing the right thing might not often be the cheapest thing, even if it's the best thing for the climate, and the benefits might be very far down the track and for future generations that Martin mentioned. And so you may need this critical mass and for industry to come together to avoid missing out. And this is backed by our experiences with the market and feedback that we've had from clients. We did hold a survey of 200 sustainability leaders in the US, UK, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, and 93% of them say they wanted to work closely with peers. So they want to collaborate to achieve their sustainability goals, but they also need to stay on the right side of the line. And we've been talking about where the challenges might arise here. And there's increasingly, I think, from my interactions with clients, a perceived risk that you end up with a lowest common denominator when you're organizing and discussing with competitors, that perhaps antitrust is being mentioned as for commercial reasons, or maybe because there is acute financial or commercial risk associated with going ahead with the project. And thinking about what the actual challenges are, Martin mentioned earlier in the EU, we have this balancing exercise between restrictions of competition and the benefits. And the particular concern that clients have really raised with us is identifying and quantifying the benefits for consumers and how you might ensure that this fair share that is required under European law is actually obtained. And the authorities have been making some really strong noises in this area. It's been a welcome recognition of looking beyond the individual, looking at the collective, and the Dutch authorities really been leading the charge here with the environmental damage agreements. And the EC seems to be playing catch up. But from my perspective, from a client's perspective, the challenge seems to be applying these guidelines and frameworks. And competition authorities looking at efficiencies in the EU have been very strict in interpreting efficiencies and quantifying efficiencies and demonstrating and evidencing efficiencies. And the balancing exercise that this involves is inherently uncertain. So I think this is the challenge that they engage with and identify the most whenever they're saying, should we go to authorities? How can we prove these externalities, and how can we get them comfortable? But the other most common frustration I hear, and I think it's what echoes what Paolo was mentioning, is the lack of coordination and certainty in application of the rules. And the Dutch is leading the charge, but some authorities have been less willing to grasp the nettle, saying this, perhaps in Brazil, others in Europe are looking to orthodox antitrust rules and saying, actually, this is a problem for legislation and not one that the competition authorities can fix. So I do think we don't necessarily, even in Europe, have a consistent approach, even if we're moving in the right direction. And that's even more difficult in respective global markets. And we've mentioned that a number of agencies have said that they're not necessarily convinced that these issues are front of mind and that there are real obstacles. Martin, you mentioned that actually you didn't have the floodgates open whenever you opened the door for these informal approaches. I think there is a risk of firms using antitrust potentially as a shield to get out of commercial justifications, but given the lack of a coherent approach globally, you do tend to have a race to the bottom. And for firms who are dealing in global markets, it really doesn't give full comfort if you know that you are going to be get blessed in the Netherlands, for instance. And there's the general concern about being on the back foot for sanctions, given the potentially very significant fines that we're looking at here. Now, obviously, that can be cured in a number of jurisdictions where you can seek some form of informal guidance, but trying to do that across the world is really quite challenging from a client's perspective. Increasingly, and I think I've seen a real change even in the last 12 months on this, the lack of a harmonized political approach and a political consensus is also having a chilling effect. And that's, echoes the problem with the climate emergency more generally. There's a lot of investigations going on in the US. There's a lot of noise coming out of attorney generals in the US. They have claimed that the biggest antitrust violation in history may be in full sight as the finance industry moves away from investment in energy. And so for firms who are acting in these global marketplaces and facing litigation risk, which is particularly acute in the US, I think there can be a risk that any sort of concerns around antitrust can be overcome in some jurisdictions, but can't extinguish the risk everywhere. And that's has been a concern in a number of these climate actions. There was a lot of attention on the UN's race to zero and the membership criteria that they imposed that restricted investment in new coal. And there has been a lot of change related to these climate initiatives and alliances for firms who are acting in global markets and trying to manage litigation risk across the world. So I think from my own perspective, the absence of a globally agreed approach is really the challenge that firms need to overcome. Also, on these climate initiatives, they're dealing with multiple stakeholders, some of well-meaning NGOs, climate activists who have varying degrees of knowledge around the antitrust rules. And so even if the scientific consensus is building in one direction, it can really be difficult for firms to navigate those alongside their other duties and the potential litigation risk that they're exposed to around the world. I think the proactive guidance that Martin is leading with is really helpful. I think it's, to Paola's example that she mentioned in the ICC task force, I can see even how that sort of smaller guidance on a lower scale about collective boycotts can be used for read across if you're approaching other authorities. So I'd see there's been a lot of guidance issued. I think these kind of precedents are going to be critical to get other agencies comfortable with how you might look at these antitrust issues. And so more of the same from other competition authorities would be welcomed. And I think that's really what we'll need as the next stage whenever the steps that firms need to take to achieve their climate objective become even more crystallized.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think that it's really clear that these kind of agreements are needed. But let me be the bad cop in this discussion. First, do you think that policies of not dealing with companies that do not implement ESG commitments could affect markets access, retention for smaller competitors, especially in economies as ours, developing economies where there are high rates of informality? And also, competition problems usually start when the agreements go beyond the purpose of the agreement, this ESG purpose, or the agreement is used as a platform for anti-competitive coordinations. Which do you think that could be the dangers derived from the implementation of ESG policies? We can start with Martin, maybe.
I think, two things. My impression is that in Europe, ESG supply chain measures will now go very fast. Yesterday, in the European Parliament, there was a political compromise achieved on ESG reporting, which is going to be an important step into the direction of the next phase, which is also pretty close, is ESG due diligence and a requirement for ESG due diligence in supply chain. So I think, Europe as a buyer of raw materials and other products from around the world is going to require from its suppliers adherence to ESG conditions in countries outside Europe and in Europe. So which in privacy it's been called the Brussels effect, and I think that this is also what we're going to see in the ESG arena, and it's for two reasons. First of all, I think most people in Europe, the electorate, they want this. They want to, they no longer want to consume products that are endangering our planet, that are clear violations of human rights. But it is very difficult for consumers and also tempting for consumers to, when they have the choice in the supermarket between the cheaper product and the more expensive, more sustainable product, to buy the more expensive one. So, but I think, when they're out of the supermarket, and I think many of us will recognize this, out of the supermarket, we're more able to make the right choice than in the supermarket. And I think this is the same thing with consumers in Europe. So that there is a strong drive. And this is, I think everyone around the world will have to get used to that. And it will take, it's an incremental process. This is not going to change from one day to another. So this is one answer to your twofold question. The other answer is, yes, there is a danger. And so I wholeheartedly agree that if you put competitors together in one room to talk about good things, the incentive is also there, or not the incentive, the temptation is there to also talk about the things that they aren't allowed to talk about. So yes, strict competition enforcement goes hand in hand with more leniency on the sustainability agreements, and that's why I hate to say and always oppose is that we are not relaxing cartel enforcement. No, that's what we do. Actually, we are just as strict, or maybe even stricter, on cartel enforcement. But for those agreements that are genuinely beneficial to society, competition law should not stand in the way. And it's not an easy area, but I also refer back to, in the European context, we have these European competition laws since 1958. And from 1958 all the way until 2001, basically, we embraced this concept, and we had a European Commission that was basically dealing with weighing the anti-competitive effects against the pro-society effects of certain agreements. That was our exemption regime. When I was in law school, this is what I studied, and in my first decade as a lawyer, this is what I did. And then suddenly in 2003, we all thought, oh no, this is completely wrong. We have to do it differently. And I think there were good reasons in 2003 to be more restrictive and to have a different process and to focus more on cartel enforcement. Yes, that's true. But like these changes go, it's a pendulum. We went out too far to the right, and now we have to swing back a little to adjust our course. That doesn't mean that we were wrong. Neither was it wrong of our predecessors in the 60s and 70s and 80s of the last century, what they were doing. No, they were responding to a call of their time. In 2003, we were responding to a call from that time. Now we need to respond to the call of our time, and that is reducing the negative externalities that are ruining our planet.
Thank you. I would ask Paola and Jonathan what recommendation we could follow in order to avoid these anti-competitive agreements on the platform of the ESG agreements, and also how can we measure when an ESG agreement is it's more beneficial for consumers, for society. What tips could you give us? Maybe Paola first and then Jonathan.
Sure. Yeah, let me, if I may, Fiorella, I just wanted to add something to what Martin just said. I think, on top of the risk of coordination, that things go beyond what is in fact agreed. I think there is an additional risk, which is increasing, entry costs, because we're now telling companies, look, you have to increase your due diligence exercise here to see, to monitor the supply chain. So there are effects, obviously, to competition that we're facing here. I mean, some of them will not accept at all. I think that's not relaxing cartel enforcement. That's something that nobody wants. But some effects on competition, I think this is where policy needs to decide where we're going. But we might be willing to accept. We are increasing costs in particular for the smaller companies that will have to face this, increased difficulties. But again, it's in exchange for, the transition to the green economy. So, I mean, that is more, that is a decision that lawmakers need to do, competition authorities as well, but that we as a society are, pushing in that direction. Now, to your question on what do we recommend companies to do? I think it's, they know already what they're not allowed to do, right? When they sit down and they know, we have trained them for years now what not to discuss in, trade associations. They know this, better than us. It's about really telling them, look, is this for real? So can we help them to go through this difficult process of, challenging their own consumers, agreeing with the ones that they do not want to agree, their competitors, and even go through a difficult competition authority or competition law process, right, to clear this, or if it needs clearance in Brazil, if they would, as in Australia as well, but in other companies, do they want to, go through the risk? So what we need to do is help them through the process and make sure that people understand that this will end up in a good result to everyone. But I think that's it. I mean, in terms of recommendations, obviously business needs guidance. We're helping them out with this. We want to hear competition authorities, like Martin saying, look, this is we will allow this if it has in fact a sustainability effect and so on and so forth, but they know already what not to do. That's a fact. Go ahead, John.
Maybe just a few additional thoughts from my side. I think I think our clients know what they need to do. They've been well trained. I think what they might forget is that when they come together for laudable aims, that is not an exemption from the competition rules in and of itself. And so, we've seen active enforcement, the AdBlue case in the EU, where car manufacturers came together for good intentions to limit negative emissions, but actually ended up coordinating and subject to significant sanctions. So I think clearly reminding them that the competition rules remain applicable is important, and active enforcement from competition authorities is helpful in that regard. This is the blueprint case that we can mention to say that it's not an exemption from the competition rules altogether. You raise an interesting point about the impact on smaller suppliers, particularly in developing countries, and I think that's something that just would need to be taken into account by the competition authorities. As Martin said, this weighing exercise is something that used to be done, used to be approved by competition authorities. It's been self-assessed for a number of years, but There are ways in which you can limit those negative effects, perhaps introducing tiers and stages for smaller suppliers, and it's something that can be worked through, but I think it needs more active involvement with the regulators because it does raise these potential exclusionary risks.
Thank you, Jonathan and Paola. So a crucial part of the analysis to determine the legality of these agreements is to prove that there are benefits for the markets, consumers. So how the determination of the welfare standard should be in these cases, how to balance the anti-competitive harm with the benefits that ESG policies could bring. Maybe Martin, could I start with that?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, it's because this is a complicated issue. That's for sure. So I want to point out first that it is important for businesses and their advisors to really look whether they can cooperate without restricting competition. And you'll be surprised how many cases of cooperation, of meaningful cooperation, are possible without significantly restricting competition. Think about the soft drinks case, the case I mentioned with the multi-packs and the soft drink bottlers that were reducing the plastic handle. Mm-hmm. We said, we see no competition on removing on plastic handles. That's not part of the competitive process. It's not a parameter of competition whether you have a handle or not. It's convenient for the consumer, but consumers do not base their decision whether the multi-pack has a plastic handle or not. So agreeing to remove that plastic handle from the wrapping does not affect competition. So this is one thing. Second, in the weighing of the benefits and the harms of an agreement, so that is if you pass the hurdle of this it has an anti-competitive effect, we introduced a kind of a two-step approach. If it's obviously that the benefits outweigh the harms, kind of a quick look analysis, don't look any further. Don't start calculating what the benefits are. And with many of the cases that we've looked into, it is clear that the benefits outweigh the harms. And you can say, well, then it wasn't probably that impactful. Could be true. But if it's only like a marginal increase of the cost price, let's say you pay 5 cents more on a cost price of 10. So 5 cents on the cost price of €1, that is not going to make a lot of difference. So if at the same time you achieve significant benefits, then you do not have to do the calculation. So this is the quick look approach that we introduced in our guidelines. And then second, if you have indeed a significant price increase and significant benefits, then you come into the calculation exercise. And there, I think it is important to keep ourselves honest and to keep ourselves as competition enforcers and as advisors and as those who are interested honest. Because I think, all of us with a heart for ESG and a heart for the environment, we like to believe the stories that we've been told. So we have to find a counterbalance. And we have to be strict to ourselves. And that's why I'm in favor of quantitative assessment, rigorous, economically approved, econometrical assessment of both the harms and the benefits. And there are methods. And here's two things that I'd like to point out. First of all, just a little story. When I started in my job 4 years ago, and I started to develop this idea that I wanted to do this and get more traction on this and start an international debate. And I went to our chief economist and I said, Chief, how are we going to calculate the benefits? And he said, well, I don't know. He's a great competition economist, and he had no idea. I said, well, okay, then let's go on a journey and find out how this works. We talked to a lot of other competition economists. They had no idea either. So, no, it's impossible, very difficult. Can't do it. No, never done before. And then we went to an environmental planning agency within the central government. And we asked them the question, how do you calculate environmental benefits? They didn't understand the question. And we didn't understand that they didn't understand our question. And so we were in this strange confusion of discussions between two economists who apparently didn't speak the same language. And they could not understand that we didn't know how to calculate environmental damages and environmental benefits, and they didn't understand that we didn't understand. So we got them together, and we got a group of environmental economists who have, decades of experience in calculating environmental benefits. Who, there are different ways. There are Nobel Prizes granted on calculating environmental. This is not rocket science. It's solid science. If you go to the Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, there are tons of people there who know exactly how to calculate environmental benefits. Mm-hmm. So it was our competition economists were living like we all do in their own little bubble. They had no idea of the wealth of knowledge that is around with environmental economists, how to calculate environmental benefits. And that's why we commissioned a report, can also be found on our website, together with the Greek authority. And we put together a team of very knowledgeable environmental economists and industrial economists, IO economists, to come up with guidelines how to calculate these environmental benefits. It's not always easy, but I would say it's not always necessary. And second, it's doable. It's really doable. We did it in a couple of cases, and it is, not rocket science for economists.
Yeah, I think that the principles of regulatory impact analysis could help in that arena, because there are a lot of experience to issue regulation. You have to do this calculation. So there are experience that could be useful to measure these impacts. But maybe Paola or Jonathan have some experience on how challenging it has been, because theoretically it could be easy, but on practice, maybe we don't have all the resources to do the calculation, or there are some bias on the authority. Do you have any experiences or challenges on doing this calculation?
No, I think we do, at least in Brazil, have, many environmental economists and well-regarded people that are used to calculate environmental damages. Because in environmental due diligences, in M&A discussions, we have this quite frequently. And obviously, we had this, I don't know, you must have heard about the Valley disaster when the dam broke. So there's really bright people, that will know what the damages are. And they are also used to do calculation of, carbon, or to become carbon neutral by, 2030, you need to do this and this and this, and this is how much money you're going to save. So they know. They have this experience already. I think it is a matter of the interesting thing. The discussion I had with the competition authority in Brazil is that when they said, look, we don't know how to calculate, we said, well, leave it to the companies, because companies will bring the burden of proof is unfortunately on my end here, except in Austria. I like the idea that they have shifted the burden of proof, but so far the burden of proof is on our side. And if you ask the mining companies in Brazil, look, I need to calculate how much damage it will cause to the environment if you don't reach, if you don't do this or that by 2030, they will know how to do it. So it is a matter of, resorting to the right people. And that's, I hear what Martin said. It is actually not what we are used to do, but it's not something that cannot be done. And the experience is out there. So, yeah. John.
I think that you mentioned a good point, Paola, about the burden of proof. And I think that's the challenge around all of this. I think there is a quantification that can be done. There are experts out there. that necessarily these things can be quite speculative. Maybe if you were to, from a competition authority's perspective, they may say they have a bit of skepticism about the company's projections. So I think that is a challenge is in crystallizing and having sufficient confidence in the benefits and efficiencies that are being offered up, and in light of the burden of proof.
Let's see, John. I mean, they have the skepticism already with the efficiencies that bring,
well, that's what I mean.
Irrespective of being sustainable or not, right? I mean, that is,
Well, I think that's the challenge. I think if the skepticism that there perhaps exists regarding efficiencies, I know competition authorities say as soon as you start arguing efficiencies, you've probably lost the case. I hope it's not the same on sustainability grounds, and that's what I think might need to be a step change from certain authorities in how they look at these efficiencies. And necessarily they're going to be projections. Necessarily there's a degree of assumptions underpinning them, and it's just what confidence they need to have in order to be convinced.
Don't tell them that you got it from me, but. It is equally speculative what the anti-competitive harms are. So we all do crystal ball glazing, and we do the best we can, and we try in a dialectic process get pros and cons, and then try to find what is the most likely on the balance of probabilities, the most likely benefit or harm. It's the same speculation. One is not more, but sometimes I think I understand that in the case of a merger, you err on the side of caution, which I understand, because you cannot undo a merger. In the case of an agreement, and particularly a sustainability agreement, I think from a policy perspective, it is not strange to err on the side of the sustainability, of the benefits. Because I think, particularly in light of the situation where we are, and you can measure it. And if it doesn't work out the way, you can undo the agreement, contrary to a merger. And that's why I also think is that we shouldn't, lawyers like to be consistent across the board. We need to use the same test for agreements, for abuse of dominance, and for mergers. And I said, no, don't do that, because they are different animals, and you can use a different. Also, from a policy perspective, you can do a different test because the cost error is different in both instances.
I mean, it's a really interesting point, Martin, on the cost error and where the authorities should land on these issues. I mean, I think there's a pretty compelling argument, given where we stand and given the significance of these climate objectives, to, if you want to call it, erring on one side of the coin, or relaxing somewhat burden of proof whenever we are looking at these kind of issues. I think that's a relevant debate to be having.
Just to finish on this very interesting debate, what are the recommendations that you could give to authorities, practitioners? Are there some specific markets that are more sensitive on their ESG commitments? Are there sectors in which our authorities should be focusing on?
If I may, from a practical perspective, I think, and I, at least my advice to companies has been, go for it. Let's try, because we will have to test the waters with the authorities, and obviously there will be quite a lot of press coverage and quite a lot of pressure from society should this ever be later investigated and punished, if obviously the sustainability goals are for real. So I think we're sort of in that position of when Uber started and had to face the taxi drivers, right? Okay, so they forced into the market, and the regulation had to follow, right? And I think this is where we are now. Obviously, there's the do's and don'ts, the obvious do's and don'ts of, don't cooperate, beyond this, and make this and go for it if it's real. But then, we'll see. I mean, if they go for it, I mean, we'll see authorities finally, giving up on this and saying, well, we want, this is the benefit that we want for society?
I've talked to many of my colleagues, and I won't mention them by name, but many of them have told me, oh yes, we fully agree with you. We will never enforce investigate. Yeah. But the only thing is we don't want to put it on paper.
See, yeah.
Well, that's good to hear. And my only I'm very heartened hearing Martin's experience and, the great work that he's been doing in his market, which I think is being used as a blueprint. And I do hope that, the door does seem to be opening from competition authorities across the globe, and they do want to interact on these issues. And I think the more we have this body of guidance, precedent, if Martin could just tell us who told him that they weren't going to enforce, then we can go and approach them next. And I think be bold, as Paula mentioned.
Yeah. Oh, one thing that we should also advise, John, maybe is move your business to Holland, right? So that
exactly. Pro business.
That's a good one. Let's go to practice on Holland. Well, thank you very much to these terrific panelists. Your contribution, I'm sure, to this discussion has been very, very useful. I'm sure it will raise awareness also in Latin American practitioner authorities that should be hearing us right now. So thank you very much. I don't know, Carlos, if you want to give some closing remarks on this topic.
Well, thank you very much, Fiorella. I do want to thank, because this panel has just been absolutely amazing. I was trying to take note of the most important issues, and at what point I said, stop taking note, because everything is just a diamond. I think that I would go back from the back to the beginning. I would start to something that Martin just mentioned at the last, which is most people do want, most consumers do want to choose the right option in favor of environment. So it's difficult when you're in the supermarket, but people do want. So that is a driver for competition law. That is a driver for authorities, and that should be the driver for markets. So we, as Paula mentioned at the end, we have to find and we have to push towards that in order to achieve it. I think that, as Jonathan mentioned, having uncertainty and the lack of coordination between authorities certainly pose a big issue and a difficulty in order to achieve that. And therefore, Paula was raising that this is a call to arms for authorities. We need cooperation. We need coordination between authorities. We need, it's not that the Latin American authorities or any other authority should raise their issue and say, well, it's more an European or a US discussion and try to find methods to diverge. We have to find a panel in which we have this opportunity to discuss, and this was precisely the objective of MoodCom this year. We have to open this discussion throughout the world and having people as Martin following and helping authorities and all of us towards the right path. I think that we have to use that experience. We have to use the things that they have learned throughout all these years and try to think about how to address them for specific countries in Latin America. We have significant amount of resources that are being affected, such as Paula was mentioning in Brazil, all the forests. We have also a very significant issues in Latin America with respect to social issues, with respect to salaries and wages, right wages, and so on. And this is a global problem. It's not only for a country. So we have to address these together. And I think that, as Martin mentioned, between a risk of type 1 and type 2 errors, it outweighs the saving the planet outweighs the risk of getting it wrong. As long as we have agreements that we can think about afterwards, I think it's better to have a cooperation with authorities and work together rather than taking out the hands and saying, I'm not going to touch base with the authority because they have a very conservative approach. We have just a very recent experience with COVID in which a huge amount of antitrust authorities, including the Mexican authorities, agreed to review agreement between competitors to determine whether those agreements could be helpful to overcome the COVID situation. So I think that we have seen it recently. We're doing this analysis. It's not something, and as Martin said, there were very limited cases, at least in Mexico, put it out in front of the authorities because companies outrage and say, well, are there other ways of finding agreements which are not anti-competitive? And only if not, then you go and discuss with the antitrust authorities. So I think that the path is clear right now. And we have to do this effort in the benefit of consumers and in the benefit of the planet. And I really thank all the members of the panel. This has been just an absolutely amazing panel. And I'm quite sure that not only the Moody's, but the judges and the coaches and all the Latin American community is very thankful to you guys for helping us to drive this path together.
Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you very much. See you in the next edition.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Queridos Mutis, bueno, después de haber tenido esta extraordinaria conferencia en la cual nos iluminaron del tema de ESG y competencia, lo que vimos a lo largo de este semestre, nos da muchísimo gusto anunciar a los ganadores y que pasarán a las audiencias finales en el mes de enero del próximo año. Entonces, Patricio, si nos quieres platicar un poco, van a ver los ganadores de este año.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Pues este año tenemos 2 excelentes finales con 4 equipos que la rompieron, la sacaron del estadio. Muchas felicidades tanto a ellos como a los demás, que desgraciadamente no pueden pasar todos, pero todos hicieron un excelente papel. Este año nuestras audiencias serán las siguientes. Como primera audiencia se enfrentará el equipo Stranger Team, que es una autoridad investigadora de Chile, contra el equipo de UDG Economic Lawyers, que es de México. Y nuestra siguiente audiencia será de otro equipo que también viene de Chile, pero con un integrante de Perú, que me parece que también el año pasado nos acompañó. Es el equipo de Big Three, quienes son autoridad investigadora, contra el equipo de Goodwins, que también es de Chile. Este año, pues bueno, Chile hizo un excelente papel, tiene 3 de los 4 finalistas, el otro es de México, pero pues reitero, felicidades a todos los equipos y muchas gracias por haber confiado otro año con Mutuo.
Pues no me queda más que felicitar a estos 4 equipos y felicitar a todos aquellos que hicieron el gran esfuerzo de competir a lo largo de estos más de 4 meses. Hicieron una labor extraordinaria, se los digo de viva voz, tanto coaches como jueces, como la gente que ha visto los videos, está sumamente emocionada y sumamente gratificada de ver el avance que tuvieron, las aportaciones y el conocimiento que hicieron a la materia, porque ciertamente el tema de sustentabilidad y competencia es un tema difícil, que nos ha llevado a lo largo de este tiempo a muchos debates, no solo nacionalmente, sino internacionalmente. Exactamente. Entonces, todo lo que han hecho ha contribuido a este conocimiento, a abonar más hacia allá. Ahorita en la conferencia lo veíamos cómo vamos mejorando en ese tema, cómo tenemos que poner manos a la obra en ese tema, y ustedes han contribuido y han puesto ese grano de arena para llevar el conocimiento a toda Latinoamérica. Entonces, muchas gracias por sus contribuciones a todos los equipos. Es una labor extraordinaria. Pronto estaremos haciéndoles llegar una encuesta para que puedan llenar una encuesta de satisfacción a todos los jueces, coaches y mutis, moderadores también. Pero también, una vez llenando esa encuesta, les haremos llegar un certificado en el cual reconocemos su aportación y su participación en este MoodComp 2022.
Y por último, digo también a los equipos que estarán en la gran final, en estos días los estaremos contactando para hacerles llegar el escrito de posición y que lo puedan preparar a lo largo de 2, casi 3 meses para que pues, hagan su mejor papel. Mucha suerte.
Muy bien, pues no nos queda más que invitarlos a las conferencias. Vamos a estar teniendo, aparte de esta conferencia que tuvimos, vamos a tener otras conferencias. Nos va a servir para seguirnos empapando del tema que tratamos en este Mood. Y a finales de noviembre vamos a tener una, el día 25, y luego en enero vamos a tener otras de manera presencial. Entonces, y virtual. Entonces, por favor, síganos en nuestras redes, síganos en las conferencias. Esto no ha terminado. Todos los multis que participaron tienen la oportunidad de participar para el próximo año como moderadores, o bien, si siguen siendo estudiantes, seguir compitiendo como multis. Tenemos muchos multis que han seguido compitiendo a lo largo de los años. Entonces, cada año cambian los casos, cambian las dinámicas y todo, y es una nueva forma de que ustedes sigan aprendiendo. El objetivo es seguir cultivando esta comunidad de materia de competencia, materia hoy de ESG, y que podamos ir creciendo esa comunidad y el conocimiento de la materia.
Claro, pues éxito a todos.
Muchas gracias.